I knew from the way Lila stood in my doorway, arms rigid at her sides, eyes fixed on a point behind me rather than on me, that whatever she had come to say would change the shape of our lives. She tried to speak and failed. She tried again, and the words came out in pieces, like glass shaken loose from a broken frame. The room was too bright for the hour, a hard afternoon light flattening everything into edges. I did not move toward anger, though it pawed at the door of my chest. I moved toward her, sat her on the edge of the bed, and told her she would not have to carry anything alone. Before we continue, thank you so much for your support. Every like, comment, and view means the world to us. We're on a mission to reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and we'd love for you to be part of that journey. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and let's grow together. Now, let's proceed. She breathed in a shuddering way that made me want to shout at the air for being so indifferent, but I held my voice, because this was not a moment for noise. It was a moment for listening, and for making promises I could keep. She said his name as if it were a splinter that had been waiting months to work through skin. Daniel. Then her eyes slid to the side, as though even the letters of it might prick. She began to describe a door that was supposed to be safe, a voice that sounded like family, a tone that claimed concern. She spoke about the kind of evening when everything looks ordinary from the outside. Dishes drying on a rack, the hum of a television 2 rooms away, someone's jacket slung over a chair like a sleeping dog, and how the ordinary can be used as camouflage. I understood only the edges at first, that trust had been bent into a key and used where it did not belong, that she had been told not to make a scene, that a phrase, "get rid of the problem," had been repeated like a commandment, cold and tidy. My mind refused a picture, even as my body recognized the outline of one forming. I said little. The few words I allowed myself were scaffolding, not verdicts. I hear you. I'm with you. You are not at fault. She broke and reformed twice while she spoke, like a wave that can't decide whether to collapse or stand. When she finished, the room narrowed to a kind of tunnel where there was only her breathing and mine. The walls had ears, the clock had an opinion, the window watched. I measured my voice against the moment and gave it just one sentence. You will not carry his shame. He will. I didn't trust myself to say more. Some words can overrun a room and trample the thing they mean to protect. That night, the house felt like a complicated machine that I had never fully understood until I needed to. Every hinge made a different confession. The refrigerator clicked like a tongue. The clock's second hand struck with a judge's patience. I made coffee I did not intend to drink and sat at the kitchen table with a dull pencil and a legal pad, not to write a manifesto, but to create an outline of mercy and war. Anger is a fire that eats what it loves. Patience is a glass that fills a little more each hour until it can be poured where it will matter. I chose the glass. Men like Daniel rely on speed, on forcing the most vulnerable to decide quickly, to panic, to forget. My weapon would be time used carefully, and the kind of quiet that sharpens instead of suffocates. I began with Lila's safety, because a plan that forgets the person it protects becomes theater. I booked a morning appointment under an alias at a clinic 3 towns over, the kind where the waiting room walls are painted in colors that pretend to be warm. I asked no questions the doctor did not need for care. I let Lila set the terms of what she wanted to know and when. We left with options spoken clearly, with numbers for a counselor, with a stack of papers that were both map and permission. In the car, she stared at the middle distance the way people stare at seas they cannot yet swim. I told her there was no time limit on deciding anything, that what had been stolen from her would not be replaced by hurry, that we would make room for grief without letting grief run the house. It is a strange truth that in the first days after harm, you become both archivist and guard. You gather while you defend. I asked Lila, gently, to write down every detail she could hold. Times, places, words, how a doorknob felt, whether the lamp in the corner was on. Not because I needed a story to satisfy me, but because a record can become a net, and a net can hold what would otherwise slip. She wrote and stopped and cried and wrote, and I told her to leave blank spaces where the memory would not yet go. I bought a small fireproof box and put the pages inside, as if to tell the universe that what she said mattered enough to defend with steel. Daniel's life, as I had watched it for years, was a scaffolding of impression. He smiled just enough in photographs. He knew which jokes were safe among the people he admired and which would make him look brave among the people he wanted to impress. He had the social habit of a mirror. Reflect what's in front of you. Seem agreeable. Keep the source of light unclear. My wife's son before I married her. Lila's stepbrother in the paperwork, if not in blood. Daniel had always liked the way family could be a credential. We're close, he had once said at a barbecue, gesturing vaguely at the cluster of us, and he'd said it with the pride of someone pointing at a skyline as though he designed it. I held those memories like pins and looked for a map that would show me where to press. The first step was to study his panic and trace its shape. It was image, mostly. He worried about embarrassment as if it were an illness carried on the air. I could work with that. I let a week pass without telling him what I knew. I saw him at a birthday dinner and asked about weather and road construction and some game he pretended to follow. I watched his eyes move when Lila's name came up, in the same way you watch the wind read a field. When he glanced down at his phone and away from my face, I saw calculation. Not remorse. Not fear of harm done. Only the old fear. How he looked, whether his life's surface would remain unscratched. Evidence is not vengeance, but it is the shovel that makes justice possible. I asked Lila if there were texts. She shook her head. He had used calls. He had used voice. He had used the body of the house. Still, men like Daniel nearly always leave something behind when they try to tidy up. A search history, a careless message to a friend, a pattern of presence where there should have been absence. I began with the simple things, phone logs, dates of visits. A neighbor who had once remarked, in passing, that Daniel's car was in our driveway on a night when it should not have been. I didn't interrogate anyone. I just asked open questions, and then I let silence be the heavy thing in the room until someone set it down. It was in the second week that Lila, with a steadiness I will never forget, placed a small white envelope on the table and said, "We should look at this together." And it were the test results that turned the euphemism he had demanded, "Get rid of the problem," into a fact with a heartbeat of its own. She stared at the paper as if it were both verdict and proof of survival. That was the middle of our chapter, the precise hinge where the fog lifted and revealed the road beneath. "He forced himself on me," she said then, the sentence clean and spare and devastating. "And then he told me to fix the humiliation he'd have to carry." The words did not come out as an argument or plea. They came out as inventory. This happened. He did this. He wanted it hidden. And here we were, not hiding. I did not promise outcomes I couldn't control. I promised effort. I promised that she would not be alone inside any office where a report might be filed, that we would choose the sequence of our moves and not let urgency trap us in someone else's timeline. We met with the counselor first. Lila chose her after meeting two others, because the third didn't speak in slogans and knew how to sit in silence without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed in 1 hour. We consulted an attorney not for war, but for light, to learn which steps would preserve options rather than close them, which conversations should be documented, which paths required patience, which required speed. Quietly, we began to build a wall of paper and names and dates that would stand even if Daniel tried to blow on it like straw. The plan came together as a diagram. Arrows, contingencies, the order of operations for dismantling a man who had built himself out of surface. Step 1 was to let him misread my calm as ignorance, to keep him unprepared. Step 2 was to gather confirmations from the places that would matter most when the time came. A counselor's notes, medical documentation, the record of phone calls at hours that betrayed respect for neither boundaries nor sleep. Step 3 was to make a space where his fear of humiliation would no longer be a leverage used against her, but a weight he would have to drag through his own days. That meant telling the truth in rooms he wanted to remain tidy. I invited him to lunch in the kind of cafe where everyone pretends to be working and no one is. He arrived in a shirt that looked like it had been ironed by someone paid to do it, and he smiled with the corners of his mouth while the center stayed tired. I asked about his job. He complained about a colleague. I let him circle, then asked if he'd spoken to Lila lately. He looked out the window as if the light had asked him a question. "We're fine," he said. "She's been dramatic." The way some men reclassify pain as theater would be funny if it weren't used as a weapon. I didn't show him the folder in my bag. Not yet. I asked if he could help me with a small home repair over the weekend, an invented task, a way to place him in a particular time and place. He agreed, because he never suspected I was the one making the outlines now. Over the next days, I prepared the ground in the spaces he trusted. I requested Lila's permission to use her written account where necessary. She granted it with a hand that trembled and a chin that did not. I met with our pastor, who had baptized nephews and blessed casseroles and believed, fiercely, that truth told in time can prevent rot. I met with the director at Daniel's workplace. No accusations, no conclusions, only a formal notice that a matter involving one of their employees might require availability for future questions. I did not smear. I did not speculate. I did not perform. I placed the first pebbles just so, knowing the rest would roll when gravity did its old and trustworthy work. The weekend came, and Daniel stood in our kitchen holding a wrench he had no idea how to use. I asked him to tighten a pipe that did not need tightening. We moved to the garage where there was more space and less chance of being overheard by walls that had already heard enough. I took out the folder then, pages in clear sleeves, dates bolded, a small index that made denial feel foolish before it even arrived. I did not raise my voice. "You will sit," I said, and my voice had the authority of someone who has practiced it in empty rooms at 2 in the morning. He sat. I slid the first page across the workbench and watched his face learn how to forget its tricks. He tried the laugh first, the one that says, "We're all adults here. Let's not be dramatic." Then he tried offense, as if indignation could build a bridge back to safety. I let both wash past me like water that has already reached the drain. When he realized those tools were useless in this room, he reached for bargain, which is the last thing the guilty do before they understand they have to run. "Let's handle this privately," he said, and the word privately hung in the air like a trap he was still hoping I would step into. I told him that privacy had been broken the moment he used the language of family to unlock a door he had no right to open. I told him the circle would widen now, but only on our terms. He asked what I wanted. I told him what I had already set in motion, that a report would be filed with professionals who know how to hold both people and facts, that Lila had medical support, that a counselor's notes would stand where we could not, that his employer would be notified not of a scandal, but of a situation requiring attention, that the first people to know would be the kind of people who do not gossip, because gossip is too small a thing for the gravity of what he did. His face whitened the way paper does when you press too hard on a clean page. He said a few words that tried to dress harm in the clothes of misunderstanding. I told him to stop before he added cowardice to his inventory. There is a moment I will remember the way sailors remember a particular star. The click of the pen I used to sign my name beneath the first formal account of what Daniel had done. Lila sat beside me, not behind. The officer took our time and asked questions the way a carpenter measures twice and cuts once. We left with copies and a case number that did not feel like justice, but did feel like a door opening toward it. On the way home, we did not talk about outcome. We talked about dinner, soup and bread, and the sweet relief of ordinary hunger. That night Lila slept, not well, but without the sudden gulps for air that had been waking the house like alarms. The unraveling, once started, obeyed its own rhythm. Human resources departments summon with courtesy and require with force. Daniel learned this on a Thursday morning when an email arrived with 3 lines and a room number. The community that had greeted him with easy nods began to tilt their heads differently when he passed. Not accusation, not certainty, just a neutrality that said we are waiting to see and we will see. A friend he'd confided in called me, voice thick with an anger that wasn't mine to manage, and asked what he could do besides be ready to testify. I told him readiness, right now, was everything. Revenge, if that is still the name for what I practiced, looked less like thunder than like tide. A little more, and then a little more, each motion tidier than the last. I did not post. I did not perform. I chose rooms with doors and people with pens. When Daniel tried to rattle Lila with a message that pretended neutrality, "Can we talk? I think we misunderstand each other." The attorney sent a letter too calm to argue with, instructing all communication to run through counsel. When Daniel stood in our driveway one evening pretending he had a right to any square of our air, I opened the door only far enough to show him the document with the judge's seal that told him to turn around. He obeyed the way men obey when they lose the trick of believing they are exceptions. There was one more conversation I needed before the world could turn without me pushing it. I asked Daniel to meet me in a public place, and he agreed because he still believed in his ability to persuade. We sat under a tree whose bark carried 100 carved initials that meant nothing to me. I told him that I had no interest in punishment for punishment's sake, and I meant it. Vengeance that burns indiscriminately becomes a second harm. I told him I wanted accountability to work like a spine, quiet, rigid, non-negotiable. He would answer to the law where the law had a voice. He would answer to the community where it had structure. He would not see Lila again. He would not attempt to persuade anyone to reframe what he did as confusion. If there was to be an apology, it would be written and delivered to the counselor, not to us directly, because healing sometimes requires a hallway between the harmed and the one who harmed. He asked what would make this stop. I told him nothing stops what has begun except time, truth, and his own willingness to walk where he should have never stepped. If a child is born, there will be legal realities that have nothing to do with his feelings. If a child is not born, there will be grief he will never be invited to witness. Either way, the word problem would never again pass his lips unchallenged. "You thought she would carry your shame," I said, and I could hear my own voice from that first night, steady now, almost gentle. "You thought the word family was a mask you could hide behind. You were wrong. You will carry what is yours." After that, the story stopped needing me in the same way. Processes moved, appointments appeared on calendars, people with lanyards and binders entered and left with polite gravity. There were nights when Lila's quiet was heavier than any scream and mornings when she laughed at something small and the laugh sounded like a window opening. We packed a bag with snacks and tissues and sat in waiting rooms where we learned the geography of the carpet. We came home with handouts and hope measured in days rather than years. I taught myself to make a soup she liked and failed the first 3 times, then succeeded, and we celebrated the way you celebrate a landing after turbulence you pretended not to fear. What became of Daniel belongs to the ledger that is not mine to read out loud in detail. I know he took a leave from work that began as personal and became a suspension with a list of conditions he could not meet. I know the friend group into which he once slipped like a knife into a drawer began to clatter when his name came up, then quiet altogether. I know that a file with his name on it sits in a drawer somewhere, and that drawers like that tend to open again. But none of those were the point, not really. The point was that Lila stopped lowering her voice when she spoke about herself, that she stood in a room with a woman who knows how to make space for pain without rearranging the furniture, that the word carry, which had been a threat, became a promise we made to each other for what is ours and ours alone. There is no triumph at the end of this chapter, only a rightness that feels like level ground after weeks of walking at a tilt. I still sometimes wake at the hour when dark is the heaviest and listen for footsteps that are not there, and when I do, I go to Lila's door and see the soft fall and rise of sleep that belongs to someone learning again how to trust the dark. On the nights when she cannot sleep, we sit at the kitchen table where the clock keeps honest time, and we talk about small things, a recipe that worked, a tree we never noticed leaning the way it does, a child who waved at us from a bus as if we were famous. We do not pretend that the hard thing did not happen. We also do not let it be the only thing that happened. If revenge is what you call it when a man rearranges the weights so that shame returns to its rightful owner, then yes, I took revenge. But to me, it felt like taking the word family back from the mouth that misused it. It felt like placing stones along a path so that my daughter could walk without guessing where to put her feet. It felt like doing the work that rage promises but cannot complete. And at the end of the day, when the house quiets and the refrigerator hums and the clock ticks like it always did, I can say the sentence I promised from the beginning and know it is not just a sentence, but a structure around us both. She will not carry his shame. He will. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us.